At 314 kilometers per hour, with the trees of the Ardennes forest flashing by and the track plunging downhill into the fearsome braking zone of Les Combes, Lewis Hamilton's voice crackled across the Ferrari radio. "That's better. Much better." To the casual viewer, it sounded like just another mid-race comment. But for Ferrari engineers, it was the sound of months of frustration beginning to lift. Because that moment, lap 19 of the 2025 Belgian Grand Prix, wasn't just about a clean entry into a high-speed chicane. It was the culmination of a painstaking behind-the-scenes effort to tailor the Super Formula 25's most delicate system to the preferences of one of Formula One's most demanding drivers. This wasn't a new floor or rear wing upgrade. It was something far more subtle, a revised Brembo brake pad compound. A piece of material barely thicker than a deck of cards, yet capable of redefining Hamilton's relationship with the car. For a 7-time world champion whose artistry lies in the micro-adjustments made under braking, the way he bleeds off speed into apexes, modulates pedal pressure to manage tyre slip, and uses weight transfer as a tool to rotate the chassis. Having the right feedback under his left foot is non-negotiable, and for the first 12 races of the season, that feel had been missing. What made the difference in Belgium wasn't some secret Ferrari invention. In fact, it wasn't even unique to Ferrari. The compound Hamilton used was a revised Brembo pad made available earlier in the season to all customer teams, but what Ferrari did differently was recognise its importance at precisely the right time, based on data, driver input, and internal pressure mounting from Hamilton's increasingly vocal frustrations. At Spa, for the first time all year, Lewis wasn't fighting the brake pedal, he was working with it. And in Formula One, that alignment between machine and driver isn't just comfort, it's lap time. Ferrari didn't just give Hamilton a new brake pad, they gave him back confidence in the most technical part of the lap, and with it, a sharper weapon in his pursuit of redemption after a rocky start to life in red. The implications stretch far beyond Spa. This seemingly minor tweak, one that had already been trialled by Charles Leclerc in Canada, marked a pivot in Ferrari's approach to Hamilton. It was a signal that the team was finally building the car around him, rather than expecting him to adapt entirely on their terms. And as the season enters its decisive final third, with the Hungarian Grand Prix just days away and the championship math still not out of reach, that change in philosophy may prove more valuable than any aerodynamic update. Because for Lewis Hamilton, confidence under braking is the foundation upon which everything else is built, from tyre preservation to overtaking to racecraft under pressure. And in Belgium, for the first time in 2025, that foundation felt solid again. To fully understand why this minor-sounding brake pad change mattered so much, you need to look at the first half of Lewis Hamilton's 2025 campaign in its entirety. A season that began with immense hope and, for many in the paddock, even higher expectations. After leaving Mercedes for Ferrari, Hamilton's move was heralded as the biggest driver shake-up in a decade. A bold, final chapter for a legend seeking to rewrite the end of his story. But what followed was a slow burn of frustration and adaptation. The Super Formula 25 wasn't an inherently poor car, but it wasn't built with Hamilton's inputs in mind. It had inherited the developmental DNA of Charles Leclerc, a driver with a more aggressive braking style, who preferred stiffer pedal response and a sharper front-end bite. For Hamilton, whose skill lies in finesse rather than force, the car's feedback in braking zones felt alien. He described it after Imola as vague, and in Austria as unsettled. Behind the polite race day interviews, there was a mounting disconnect, not just between driver and machine, but between driver and team. Ferrari, to their credit, weren't ignoring the issue. The engineering division under Loic Serra and Enrico Cardile had been dissecting telemetry, brake pressure maps, and corner entry deltas since the Bahrain opener. But the challenge was complex. Hamilton's struggles couldn't be solved by aero tweaks or suspension geometry alone. Though Ferrari had already modified the rear suspension architecture with a lower wishbone to help stabilize the platform under braking, what they needed was a new approach to brake modulation, a way to give Hamilton the precise feedback loop his left foot demanded. Enter the Brembo variant, a subtly different pad compound, designed for smoother thermal response and a more linear pressure curve. It wasn't a revelation. But it was enough, and that nuance is what defines this moment in the Ferrari-Hamilton journey. Because in the world of elite motorsport, the difference between an understeering entry and a perfectly balanced apex isn't measured in seconds, it's in milliseconds, it's in feel. And for Hamilton, whose career has been built on extracting perfection from the marginal, that feel is everything. The brake pad itself had been tested by Leclerc in Montreal, where he'd given it positive feedback but ultimately reverted to his standard preference. Hamilton, meanwhile, had waited. Not because he doubted the material, but because he wanted to understand its long-run behaviour, heat cycling characteristics, and consistency under varying grip conditions. Belgium was the moment he gave it a full race weekend, and the result, by all accounts, was transformative. From a technical standpoint, the revised Brembo brake pad used by Lewis Hamilton at Spa represents more than just a swap of components. It marks a strategic realignment of how Ferrari interprets brake modulation within their chassis philosophy. The pad compound in question wasn't softer or less durable in the conventional sense. What made it different was its thermal behaviour curve and how it responded to pedal pressure over microphases of deceleration. Engineers refer to this as the pad's modulation gradient, a measure of how evenly and predictably the braking torque builds relative to the driver's foot input. In the Super Formula 25, this curve had previously been too aggressive for Hamilton's taste, especially in high-speed braking zones, where weight transfer happens violently and precision is critical. He needed more elasticity in the pedal response, not to brake later necessarily, but to brake smarter, especially through corners like La Source and the bus stop chicane, where subtle inputs define the racing line. Hamilton's feedback during earlier races pointed to a deeper issue. He couldn't trust the rear end of the car under heavy deceleration. That lack of trust wasn't just about mechanical balance. It stemmed from an inability to feel the transition between regenerative braking from the hybrid system and hydraulic braking through the Brembo calipers. In modern Formula One cars, especially those with brake-by-wire systems, this transition is managed by complex software algorithms. But if the underlying hardware, including the pads, doesn't provide predictable friction behaviour, the driver ends up chasing the balance corner by corner. For a driver like Hamilton, who famously dances on the brake pedal to set the car's rotation before committing to throttle, this lack of consistency became a mental and physical barrier to performance. By contrast, the updated pad introduced in Belgium featured a refined material mix with greater heat resilience and a slower fade curve, meaning it held its performance characteristics more reliably across a broader range of temperatures. This allowed Hamilton to exploit longer braking phases, staying on the brakes deeper into the corner without sacrificing entry stability. Telemetry from Spa revealed a key change. Hamilton was more willing to trail brake into turn 8 and turn 10, using the rearward weight shift to help rotate the Super Formula 25, something he had avoided in earlier races where the unpredictability of the pedal feel made him overly cautious. Ferrari engineers also noted reduced spike behaviour in the rear brake temperature deltas, a sign that Hamilton was managing the system more efficiently lap after lap. The result? Not a dramatic leap in lap time, but something more valuable: consistency. And in Formula One, consistent brake performance doesn't just help over a race distance. It builds driver confidence, reduces tyre lockups, improves energy deployment predictability, and sharpens the car's response to throttle transitions. In Spa, Hamilton wasn't just quicker through the lap. He was finally able to drive to the limit of the Super Formula 25's braking capability without fearing that limit would move from one lap to the next. What made Ferrari's decision to hand Hamilton the revised Brembo pad at Spa so strategically significant was not just the performance benefit, it was the timing. By mid-season, the Italian team found itself in a complex balancing act, managing two elite drivers with distinctly different styles, while fighting to remain relevant in both the Constructors' and Drivers' Championships. Charles Leclerc is the incumbent and developmental nucleus of the Super Formula 25, had shaped the car's behaviour through its early concept phases, particularly in how it handled under-braking and mid-corner rotation. The baseline setup leaned toward his aggressive entry technique, where a sharp front response and heavy brake bite allowed him to snap the car into rotation. For Hamilton, who builds speed more gradually and depends on a predictable pedal arc to layer cornering forces, this setup created a cognitive dissonance between expectation and response, and that disconnect was becoming a liability. Strategically, Ferrari had two options. They could double down on Leclerc's preferences, optimizing for immediate results with the more experienced Super Formula 25 driver, or they could begin customizing the platform for Hamilton, who, though still adapting, had proven that with the right tools he could deliver championship-contending performances. The decision to provide him with the new brake pad, a component he had specifically requested, marked the first visible sign of Ferrari choosing the latter. And while it might seem trivial to those outside the garage, internally it was a massive philosophical shift, building performance around the driver, rather than expecting adaptation. The choice also carried strategic ripple effects beyond setup. With Hamilton now able to extract more from the braking zones, Ferrari unlocked new race strategy windows. At Spa, simulations showed that Hamilton's improved modulation allowed for better tyre preservation, opening the possibility of a longer first stint and an undercut on slower, degrading compounds. While the final race result didn't reflect a podium due to early track position, the data confirmed a strategic expansion. Hamilton's braking consistency gave the pit wall more flexibility. And in Formula One, flexibility is often more valuable than outright pace. It enables teams to respond to virtual safety cars, shift tyre allocation priorities, and bait rival strategies without compromising their own. This brake pad upgrade wasn't about a silver bullet. It was about giving Hamilton another lever to control his race, one that had been absent all season. And as the team prepares for tighter, more technical tracks like Hungary and Singapore, that additional control becomes exponentially more powerful. Ferrari didn't just hand Hamilton a new part, they handed him a vote of confidence, one that could redefine the second half of their 2025 campaign. Behind every technical upgrade in Formula One, there's a human story. And this one revolves around two drivers separated not just by setup preferences, but by philosophical outlooks on racing. Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc may wear the same red overalls, but their approaches to performance, feedback, and even how they communicate with engineers differ profoundly. That difference has been on full display throughout 2025, not through arguments or controversies, but through subtle contrasts. Body language in press conferences, tone over team radio, even how they walk the paddock. For Leclerc, Ferrari is a known quantity. He grew up within the team's ecosystem, has long had influence over car development, and doesn't need to ask for the steering wheel to feel a certain way. It already does. For Hamilton, every weekend has been a negotiation, every corner entry a test of compromise. And until Spa, the balance of power had clearly tilted toward the Monegasque. That changed in Belgium, but not in a dramatic way. There was no headline-grabbing clash, no viral radio rant, just a sense, among engineers, mechanics, and perhaps even Leclerc himself, that the tide was quietly turning. When Hamilton publicly thanked the team for finally giving him a component he could work with, he did so carefully. He acknowledged that Leclerc had already trialled the pad in Canada, that the team had evaluated it fairly, and that the solution was available to everyone. But underneath that diplomacy was something else: relief. For the first time, Hamilton didn't have to justify his preferences. He didn't have to convince the garage that he wasn't off the pace, just off the right tools. In that sense, Spa wasn't just a brake pad test. It was an emotional inflection point in Hamilton's Ferrari journey. And then there's Leclerc, the quiet competitor who, despite his boyish demeanour, is fiercely territorial when it comes to his status within the team. He didn't object to Hamilton receiving the upgraded pad, but insiders say he made it clear he would stick with his preferred compound. That decision, while valid from a performance perspective, also sends a message: this is my setup, he can have his. There's no hostility, no open rivalry, but there is now a duality within Ferrari that hadn't existed before. Two developmental paths, two driver setups, two competing data streams feeding into one chassis. And while Ferrari insists this is a strength, history has shown how quickly it can become a fracture if not managed with surgical precision. The human stakes are rising. Hamilton needs to prove he can still lead a top team at the highest level. Leclerc needs to reassert his claim as Ferrari's future. And the engineers? They're stuck in the middle, balancing two world-class talents with divergent needs, each corner of each lap demanding its own interpretation. The brake pad was just the first concession. What comes next could define who leads Ferrari into the final third of the 2025 season, and who simply follows. With just 11 races remaining in the 2025 Formula One season, the brake pad upgrade may seem like a granular change, but in championship terms, its timing couldn't be more critical. At Spa, Lewis Hamilton walked away with solid points, but more importantly, with renewed confidence, a factor that's not accounted for in spreadsheets, but often shows up in final standings. As of the Belgian Grand Prix, Hamilton sits fifth in the Drivers' Championship, trailing Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, Charles Leclerc, and Oscar Piastri. The gap to the top is formidable: 63 points behind Verstappen, 38 behind Leclerc, but not insurmountable, especially with triple headers looming and tracks like Singapore, Mexico, and Brazil still on the calendar. All circuits where Hamilton has historically thrived when given the right machinery. What makes this situation unique is the micromath Ferrari is now doing behind closed doors. In a normal season, the team might double down on its leading driver, which by points alone remains Leclerc. But in this case, the numbers aren't just about championship positioning, they're about rate of progression. Since receiving the upgraded brake pad and the revised rear suspension, Hamilton's delta to Leclerc has shrunk notably in high braking zones. Monza, Zandvoort and Singapore will emphasise these gains even further. Internal simulations show that if Hamilton's current development curve continues, he could outscore Leclerc over the next 5 rounds, and that would shift not just Ferrari's internal priorities, but the strategic weight they place on each driver's future. Constructors' math is equally telling. Ferrari sits second, but just barely, with McLaren surging and Mercedes not far behind. Every finish, every position, is now worth millions in prize money and leverage for 2026. If Hamilton's consistency improves thanks to these braking upgrades, he could become Ferrari's points anchor, allowing the team to strategize more aggressively with Leclerc. And if both drivers begin performing at similar levels, Ferrari can split strategies, undercut with one, overcut with the other, to force errors in Red Bull's execution. In the numbers game of Formula One, small technical upgrades like a brake pad often feel invisible. But the points swing they enable. That's where championships are won and lost. And if Ferrari's internal data is right, Spa may have been the race where Hamilton's title hopes shifted from theoretical to possible. Throughout Formula One history, championship campaigns have rarely hinged on headline-grabbing upgrades. More often, they've turned on small, almost imperceptible changes, tweaks in setup, revised materials, or subtle aerodynamic shifts that recalibrate a driver's relationship with the car. And in this regard, Lewis Hamilton's experience at Spa is part of a well-worn pattern. Think back to 2012, when Sebastian Vettel's Red Bull team introduced a minor exhaust revision mid-season that suddenly unlocked the Red Bull 8's full aerodynamic potential. Or in 2007, when Kimi Räikkönen benefited from a last-minute gearbox calibration tweak that helped him close a 17-point gap to win the title by a single point. Formula One is a sport where millimetres matter, where marginal gains are amplified over race distances, and where the right adjustment, even something as simple as brake pad feel, can shift the momentum of a title fight. Hamilton himself has been here before. In 2014, it was the refinement of Mercedes' brake-by-wire system that gave him the edge over Nico Rosberg in the second half of the season. In 2018, it was a front suspension tweak at Silverstone that restored his confidence in the car's rotation through high-speed corners. In both cases, Hamilton didn't just respond, he evolved. He translated newfound mechanical trust into psychological dominance. The common thread across these moments isn't just technical adaptation. It's the synergy between a driver's instinct and the car's feedback loop. A relationship that, once aligned, becomes exponentially more powerful than any wind tunnel result. Ferrari's decision to give Hamilton the upgraded pad mirrors a broader trend within elite teams, tailoring the machinery to the driver's natural rhythm. It's a philosophy that Mercedes adopted during the peak of their dominance, and that Red Bull currently exemplifies in their near-custom tailoring of the Red Bull 21 to Max Verstappen's throttle inputs and rotation style. The risk, of course, is internal divergence, building one car for 2 drivers and slowly splitting your development path. But the reward is clear. If a team can create the environment for both drivers to extract their maximum potential, the competitive ceiling rises dramatically. For Ferrari, a team steeped in tradition and occasionally weighed down by its own legacy, this marks a subtle but significant shift in attitude. No longer is the car sacred and the driver secondary. Now, the driver's feel, his ability to stop, rotate and accelerate with confidence, is being treated as the central axis of development. And in doing so, Ferrari is not just responding to history, they're learning from it. Because if the brake pad feels right and the driver feels right, the results will follow, as they so often have before. While the revised brake pad itself may not appear revolutionary on paper, it forms just one part of a deeper, multifaceted shift in Ferrari's technical philosophy for 2025. The Maranello squad is no longer approaching car development through traditional silos, suspension here, aero there, engine mapping in isolation. Instead, under the leadership of Loic Serra and technical director Enrico Cardile, the Super Formula 25's evolution has become a study in systems integration. And nowhere is this more evident than in the interplay between braking hardware, hybrid energy recovery systems, and rear suspension geometry, all of which have seen targeted refinements in the past 4 races to better suit Hamilton's driving DNA. Start with the brake-by-wire system. Since 2014, when Formula One mandated hybrid power units, managing rear brake torque has become a complex blend of software and mechanical inputs. The internal combustion engine's deceleration, known as engine braking, interacts with the motor generator unit kinetics regeneration phase and must blend seamlessly with the hydraulic braking supplied by the Brembo calipers. In theory, this coordination is invisible to the driver. In practice, the feel of that deceleration, especially in low-speed corners or traction zones with uneven grip, can make or break a lap. Hamilton had been vocal early in the season about the Super Formula 25's inability to give him consistent feedback under braking. Engineers traced the issue not to a single fault, but to a mismatch in how the original brake pad's torque curve aligned with the hybrid recovery profile and suspension dive characteristics. Ferrari's solution was layered. First, they modified the rear suspension's anti-squat characteristics by lowering the front arm of the upper wishbone, reducing pitch sensitivity under deceleration. Then, they implemented a new calibration in the brake-by-wire software to give Hamilton more natural deceleration progression. But crucially, it was only with the integration of the new Brembo pad, whose slower torque rise and smoother initial bite complemented both changes, that the system came alive. Suddenly, the car wasn't fighting Hamilton on corner entry, it was cooperating. This holistic upgrade strategy is part of what Ferrari engineers internally refer to as driver-linked response tuning. It means prioritizing not just the output of each component, but how those outputs feel in unison to the driver behind the wheel. The brake pedal is no longer treated as an isolated input channel. It's a storytelling device, transmitting the car's intent, grip, and balance in real time. For Hamilton, who builds his rhythm through feel, this subtle harmonization has unlocked an entirely new performance window. Technically, this is where modern Formula One has evolved, not in who builds the fastest car in a wind tunnel, but in who can sync driver, hardware, and software into a seamless dynamic loop. The new brake pad wasn't innovative alone, but as a final puzzle piece in a redesigned braking philosophy, it may represent Ferrari's most intelligent technical adjustment all season. And for Hamilton, it might just be the first time since joining Ferrari that the car is finally speaking his language. Ferrari's subtle but effective evolution of the Super Formula 25's braking system has not gone unnoticed in the paddock. While no team is panicking just yet, the data from Spa triggered a quiet response among their closest competitors. At McLaren, engineers reportedly reviewed brake temperature telemetry and pedal trace overlays from Norris's car in detail, following Hamilton's improved consistency at Spa. Though McLaren has a different chassis philosophy and uses a distinct suspension setup, the notion that Ferrari could resolve their biggest driver-car disconnect mid-season caught the attention of team principals and strategists alike. In fact, McLaren's technical director, Peter Prodromou, alluded in an internal debrief to reassessing mechanical feedback balance before Monza, coded language perhaps for responding to what Ferrari had just managed to pull off. Over at Red Bull, the dominant force of the hybrid era, the reaction was more measured, but no less alert. Max Verstappen's Red Bull 21 continues to lead the championship comfortably, yet the team has been known to guard its performance edge obsessively. Red Bull uses Hitco braking materials rather than Brembo, and their brake philosophy leans towards sharp bite and quick rotation, suiting Verstappen's rapid corner entry style. But with Spa revealing that Ferrari's seemingly underperforming car could come alive under the right driver conditions, Red Bull is now recalibrating how closely they monitor driver-specific inputs across race simulations. According to sources within the team, they've begun analysing whether their development curve has leaned too far into Verstappen's feedback, potentially limiting flexibility for Sergio Perez, whose braking demands more modulation than aggression. Even Mercedes, still rebuilding its 2022-2024 identity crisis, is watching closely. They know Hamilton's feedback profile intimately, and many within Brackley were unsurprised that brake feel was the catalyst for his resurgence. For George Russell, who prefers a more reactive front end and uses the brakes more digitally, Mercedes may now need to ensure their ongoing W15 development doesn't create similar asymmetry between their drivers. With Hamilton gone and the driver lineup for 2026 still undecided, the lessons Ferrari is applying with Hamilton might help Mercedes avoid future misalignments in their own program. The larger implication: in the current Formula One landscape, where raw power units are frozen and aerodynamic convergence is narrowing, driver adaptability and customized feedback loops are becoming the new battlegrounds. And with Spa as a case study, Ferrari has just demonstrated that solving for feel, not just downforce or horsepower, can disrupt the hierarchy. Now it's up to the rest of the grid to decide if they'll follow that lead or risk falling behind. The ripple effects of Hamilton's improved braking synergy won't stop at Spa. With the Hungarian Grand Prix up next, a circuit that demands surgical braking precision and flawless car rotation in its tight, twisty layout, the benefits of the revised pad and accompanying setup tweaks will be tested under even greater scrutiny. The Hungaroring, often compared to a full-length kart track, is notoriously punishing on rear tyres and exposes any imbalance in braking stability or traction under load. If Hamilton's newfound confidence in the Super Formula 25's braking system holds up in Budapest, it could signify not just a track-specific gain, but a platform shift in his overall adaptability and Ferrari's faith in it. Strategically, this puts Ferrari in an interesting position. Should Hamilton outperform Leclerc on a track that traditionally rewards technical mastery over raw pace, the team may be forced to reconsider its development allocation heading into the final third of the season. Hungary, Singapore and Suzuka are all races where braking rhythm, corner entry, confidence and tyre management converge, all areas where Hamilton historically excels. With Ferrari likely to introduce incremental upgrades tailored for high downforce circuits, there's an emerging possibility that they'll begin tuning those packages more toward Hamilton's driving style, especially if the internal data continues to favour his adaptation curve over Leclerc's consistency. But beyond hardware, the implications stretch into the realm of psychology. For most of the season, Hamilton has been on the back foot, managing expectations, adapting to a car not built for him, and fielding questions about whether the move to Ferrari was a romantic swan song rather than a competitive rebirth. With each race that sees him draw closer to Leclerc, that narrative starts to shift. And as the drivers become more evenly matched in both qualifying and race trim, Ferrari's internal dynamics, from race strategy priority to chassis direction, will subtly begin to reflect that parity. In a sport where confidence and machinery must exist in perfect balance, Hamilton is finally being handed the tools to influence the balance himself. The Hungarian Grand Prix could be the first true test of whether this is a temporary setup win, or the beginning of a broader Ferrari strategy pivot. Because if the car continues to come toward Hamilton, the grid will need to ask a different question entirely. Not whether he can adapt to Ferrari, but whether Ferrari is finally ready to adapt to him. If Spa marked the moment Lewis Hamilton and the Super Formula 25 began speaking the same language, then the long-term impact of that translation could redefine Ferrari's competitive trajectory not just for this season, but well into the 2026 regulation cycle. Formula One is entering a transitional era, with major aerodynamic and power unit regulation changes looming in 2026. Teams are already laying the groundwork for their next-generation concepts. Every setup note, every feedback loop, every successful driver-specific adaptation in 2025 feeds into the foundational assumptions that will guide the design of their 2026 challenges. And at Ferrari, Hamilton's ability to unlock performance through feel, through the minute harmonization of brake torque, engine response, and chassis behavior, is quickly becoming a template for how future cars might be built. This goes beyond pedal feel. It touches on Ferrari's core identity. Historically, the Scuderia has leaned toward producing aggressive, front-limited machines, cars that reward drivers with sharp inputs and tolerate few errors. That's aligned with Leclerc's approach, but it hasn't always produced consistent race day execution. Hamilton's presence introduces a different design logic, one that emphasizes progressive control, mechanical consistency, and psychological flow. If the Super Formula 25's recent upgrades prove to be more than a patch, if they signal the beginning of Ferrari building cars that are easier to drive on the limit, then the team could become a more formidable force across race distances and changing conditions, not just in qualifying bursts. For the driver lineup, this philosophical shift could quietly influence the post-2025 driver market as well. If Ferrari shows it can accommodate a 7-time world champion's needs without internal combustion, it signals to the paddock, and to young stars eyeing Maranello, that the team is evolving into a more collaborative, feedback-driven operation. That's a departure from the image of Ferrari as a sometimes opaque, top-down engineering fortress. Hamilton, by demanding feel and transparency, may end up reshaping how the team operates for years to come. And then there's the regulatory horizon. As Formula One prepares to reintroduce active aerodynamics, revised battery systems, and radically simplified power units, the teams that excel won't necessarily be the ones with the fastest CFD models. They'll be the ones who can create stable platforms that allow elite drivers to push consistently from lap 1 to lap 70. In that future, the lessons Ferrari is learning with Hamilton about modulation, integration and driver trust won't just matter, they'll be essential. In a season defined by marginal gains and relentless adaptation, the story of Lewis Hamilton's upgraded brake pad might seem, on the surface, like a footnote. But in reality, it may prove to be the quiet pivot point where his Ferrari journey finally took flight. What began as a subtle adjustment, a compound change shared across the Brembo-supplied grid, evolved into something more profound. The first clear signal that Ferrari is willing to bend the car toward Hamilton's instincts rather than expecting him to bend to theirs. And in doing so, they've done more than improve his lap times. They've validated his feedback, empowered his racecraft, and relit the competitive fire that many feared had started to dim after 2 difficult years at Mercedes. Now, as the 2025 Formula One calendar enters its high-stakes late summer run, with Hungary, Zandvoort, Monza, and Singapore forming a demanding 4-race gauntlet, Hamilton is no longer on the back foot, he's in the fight. Maybe not for the title, at least not yet, but certainly for influence. Influence over how the Super Formula 25 evolves in real time. Influence over the team's strategic risk calculus. And perhaps most crucially, influence over the developmental DNA of Ferrari's 2026 car, a machine he'll likely be piloting into the twilight of one of the sport's most remarkable careers. From the outside, Spa will be remembered as a solid points haul, a quiet weekend. No podium, no controversy. But for those inside the garage, the engineers monitoring pedal traces and the data analysts tracking corner entry deltas, it was something else entirely. It was the moment the car finally gave something back to the man behind the wheel. A man who, for months, had been asking not for special treatment, but for symmetry between his inputs and the machine's outputs. At Spa, that symmetry finally arrived. And with it, the possibility of a Ferrari that doesn't just carry Hamilton's name on its engine cover, but bears his fingerprints in every detail that matters. Looking ahead to Hungary, the question isn't whether Ferrari will be competitive. The question is whether Hamilton's upward trend will hold, and whether Leclerc will respond to the growing parity with a renewed edge of his own. The intra-team dynamic, once clearly tilted toward Charles, is beginning to level. And when 2 elite drivers are separated by feel rather than outright pace, the team with the better tools and the better listening skills usually comes out on top. This brake pad story is, in the end, about more than friction material. It's about alignment, mechanical, psychological, and philosophical. And in Formula One, when a driver as precise as Hamilton begins to feel that alignment, the rest of the grid would do well to pay attention. Because confidence, once found, has a way of compounding. And Lewis Hamilton, for the first time in red, is starting to drive like a man who believes the car beneath him finally believes in him too.